Welcome to the Exposing Mold podcast, where I, Keely Severson, Alicia Swamy, and Eric Johnson are exposing mold. Today we have author Arnold Mann, who has written a book called They're Poisoning Us. Now, we did read this book in preparation for our conversation with Arnold Mann, and we found three really important points that Arnold investigated and exposed. There was an incident at Southwest Airlines where a lot of employees were poisoned by mold in the environment, and some of them were so sick that they died, and some were so sick that they were permanently injured and never recovered. And none of them ever got legal retribution for their issues. Arnold, in your book, you also covered the Gulf syndrome and some of the political aspects that kept that syndrome from not being honestly researched and investigated. And you also discussed in your book the Cleveland incident in which Stachybotrys was implicated in a few cases of pulmonary hemorrhaging in infants. And the CDC, a few years after that research was published, they actually brought in, or I'm sorry, I misspoke. It wasn't research that was published, but some observations that were made and some data that was collected. And years later, the CDC brought in a team of unnamed experts to essentially retract this study. Now, when you look at how this has all come about, where the organizations are seemingly avoiding any responsibility or honesty around some of the injuries that are caused by environmental damage, were you shocked to uncover this level of corruption in your investigation?
I was very shocked. It started actually with Southwest Airlines Reservation Center in San Antonio. And the whole thing started off at Time magazine. And I said to my editor, why don't we do something on sick building syndrome? This was back in 97, 98, when hardly anything was being written on it. And I thought it sounded like a good idea, and so did he, for the professional managerial subscribers to Time. Only 1 million of the 4 million readers, that is, subscribers to the magazine, a special piece for them. Because of what we found, because of the incriminating information that we found in particular and its effect on public health, that piece was pulled out of that professional managerial section and put in every issue of Time as the lead business story in Time that week, going out to 5 million readers and the 200,000 copies sold on the newsstands as well. That's how important and shocking it was to Time to find out what we found out. And of course, as you know, what we found out was that not only did the airline know about how sick people were, not only did they know about the mold in the building, which they were saying there was nothing to it and there was no findings of mold in the building at all, they had suppressed all information about the mold being in the building and hidden it from everybody. And the employees were too afraid to bring it up because they were afraid of losing their jobs. And at $20 an hour for a senior rep at the reservation center in San Antonio was the highest paid persons in San Antonio. They couldn't afford to lose their jobs. And the airline was pretty much motivated by fear of legal action, which in fact finally did come when 7 of the Southwest Reservation Center people who had been forced to leave work because of seizures and strokes and being rendered basically incapable of living a normal life, joined together and sued the airline. And that's what started this whole thing up. And what they managed to find through disclosure during that court case was that the airline knew about it from the very beginning. In fact, they had done a mold remediation 8 years earlier or 7 years earlier with everybody in the building and all the toxic mold going all over the place and people getting sicker by the minute, let alone by the day. So that's the kind of stuff we found. I can give you more specifics if you like, but that's an overview. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I think my mic hiccuped. The thing that I found really fascinating in a later part of that book was the Gulf War syndrome, and the particular piece that just floored me, even though we're kind of aware that this happens, just to read the whole story, but they were trying to frame Gulf War syndrome as a psychosomatic illness. And so when they were providing grant funding for research, 5 institutions applied for the grant funding. And at the time that this grant funding was available, it had already been shown in a double-blind study that this was not a psychosomatic or in your head issue. And even after that study was performed, stating that the grant funding, whoever was allocating that money, dictated who was going to research and what was allowed to be researched. And the 4 institutions that wanted to research psychosomatic causes of multiple chemical sensitivity, they were granted the money. And the 1 institution or foundation that wanted to research chemical causes for Gulf War syndrome, because it very much was a chemical injury, they were denied. And that just shook me, because it is really a testimony to the way that research is controlled and what we're allowed to know and what is even allowed to be in a peer-reviewed journal. And that, to me, is almost medical fraud. And was society just shook when your book came out? And, how was this received? How did you process this as you were uncovering this story?
How did I process it? When I come upon something like this, it fuels me. I'm sorry to say, in the midst of all this tragedy, I just want to know why. Why is it that they didn't fund that research? Why did they suppress any attempt to find out what was going on? And I'll answer the question to the best of my ability and tell you that with 250,000 of the 700,000 people, not just military people, but these are human beings going over there to fight this war. Of the 700,000, 250,000 people came back, not just sick, but in many ways very disabled. And they had to answer for it. What did they say? They said originally that there were no chemical weapons exposures in this war. In fact, the United States military, under order from the heads of the guys, bombarded the U.S., bombed the Saddam Hussein's toxic weapons and sent it into the brains and into the breathing of everybody on the battlefield. That's what they maybe did not want people knowing about. So the research is then given to someone who's not going to find out what they don't want found out. And that's kind of it. Does that answer the question somewhat?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you. That does answer the question. And then I also want to talk specifically about the Cleveland incident, where they had a team of unnamed experts retract a previous scientist's team findings or information. Were you questioning the reality of science and how it works when you stumbled upon this information to see things like this?
I can tell you this, that I learned about this in 2000. I was a speaker at the EPA conference, and I had been writing about, in Time Magazine and USA Weekend about toxic mold, these cover stories. I will tell you that when I got there, everybody, and this were mostly industrial hygienists, wanted to know from me one thing in particular: when's your next story coming out? And the reason why is because when these were the highest reader response of any article coming out. I'm not pinning a feather in my own cap. I'm just saying this was a hot topic that everybody wanted to know about. And when it came out, those were the highest reader response. What the indoor environmental people at the annual EPA meeting wanted to know was, when's your next story coming out? You know why? Because they had to hire up to cover all the phones ringing off the hooks for their own business, to clean up houses and stuff and look for toxic mold. That's what they wanted to know. Incidentally, the other person who was supposed to be the keynote speaker was the head of the EPA, and she didn't show up. And maybe because of what was going on at the time, she just didn't want to be around for this. It's possible, I don't know.
That wasn't Barbara Spark, was it?
I don't recall at this time. It was 20 years ago, but it was somebody who didn't choose to show up and speak at the meeting that I was going to be the keynote speaker at too. And I suspect that this was not something that she or he, it was a she, that this woman wanted to be exposed to, let alone in the middle of, possibly.
Yeah, what we find very interesting, and we were talking about this and have been prolonging this conversation, is that during that time frame, it seemed like because it was such a hot topic, there was research coming out on it. We've already met some retired researchers that have done work on sick buildings and connecting that with mycotoxins and mold. And we're finding the new data that's coming out is actually telling the opposite story. That it's saying mold is a hysterical illness. You know, there's been no findings. There's no direct diseases or conditions that it causes. And so I just wanted to ask you, can you maybe tell us why you think that is?
I can tell you why I think that is. In other words, why is it all in your brains, right? That it has nothing to do, it's all emotional, right? It's psychological, it's a psychosomatic illness. A long time ago, actually, I think it was Robert Haley who brought it up. Robert Haley was a researcher with Gulf War. And he brought this up to me. And it was a story of Barry Marshall. Did anybody ever hear of Barry Marshall? He was the guy who figured out that, what's it called? He was the one who figured out that stress, which had always been the cause of peptic ulcer disease. Okay, remember when peptic ulcer disease, it was executive stress. It's all executive stress, right? Well, Barry Marshall was the guy who figured out that it was the H. pylori bacteria. He was an Australian researcher, and he figured out it was the H. pylori bacteria. When he found that out, and when he published it, and when he tested it on himself even, taking H. pylori bacteria and swallowing and getting sick, when he figured out that this was the cause, and when he started curing it with courses of antibiotics, the entire medical establishment called him a fake. And they did it, and they did it, and they did it. Why did they do it? In particular, they did it because the pharmaceutical had just come out, the pharmaceutical industry, with H2 blockers, which is meant to treat peptic ulcer disease. And all of a sudden, the billions of dollars they were going to make on peptic ulcer disease turned into a zero because you could cure it with antibiotics. And they got all the physicians to scream that there's nothing to it. Marshall is wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And this went on until Barry Marshall was deemed right and won the Nobel Prize for his discovery. Now, what's going on with regards to this condition? Is it all in our heads, or are people standing to profit by treating people emotionally for it, all the psychiatrists and psychologists, like they did with the peptic ulcer patients? Or is it a threat to the pharmaceutical industry? It's a threat to of course, the insurance industry because of all the legal aspects of it. So it's all being deemed to be psychosomatic because that's the label they throw on something that they can't define and would cost them a fortune if in fact they did try to define it as being in any way valid. Does that make sense? But Barry Marshall is the perfect metaphor for this. Not perfect, but it's a damn good one.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We were just wondering why. And just to go back to that, those Th2 blockers are now being pulled off the market left and right because it increases your death by 20%.
That's correct.
So, There's the
Well, that it was just a financial issue back then. Now it's more.
Yeah.
But it was in everybody's not interest to say Barry Marshall's right and for doctors to go ahead and just prescribe the antibiotics and say goodbye to ulcer disease.
Well, when Ruth Etzel, the CDC epidemiologist who was investigating the 1994 Cleveland pulmonary hemorrhage incident, narrowed down the suspects to the toxic mold Stachybotrys, it was just a preliminary hypothesis. It was an idea. This was showing up. It seemed to fit the parameters of a toxic agent that might be responsible for the infant deaths and the lung bleeding. And from what I understand, in order to cast doubt on this, they framed it as if it was a study rather than a hypothesis and said it was a poor study design and you haven't proven your case, so therefore we can toss this out, when basically all it was a request for further research.
Correct.
So the entire framing of this as a poor study design was a tactic, because it wasn't an actual study. It was simply a preliminary starting point for further research into the toxic mold.
And it was also very, very suggestive, because they looked at homes of people who had infants where there was no Stachybotrys, and then they looked at the Stachybotrys at the homes where the infants became sick and they died, and there was Stachybotrys, and there was no crossover there. It was actually a very suggestive study, because they were looking at both sides of this coin. And they were looking for more research, which of course was stopped and never started again.
Well, I believe that I've got a example of corruption that can fit right in there with the rest of them. And that is the creation of the chronic fatigue syndrome. Because I was a survivor and prototype for the Holmes 1988 chronic fatigue syndrome. I was involved with the creation of the syndrome, and I initially refused to get involved because I already knew that I was being affected by toxic mold. The researchers wanted to find a virus, and I pointed, in fact, the other survivors pointed at the toxic mold in the buildings and said, this is something that needs to be looked into. And when they said, well, this really shouldn't interfere, because when researchers come to investigate, when the syndrome is coined and more researchers get interested, then we can straighten all this out. And I go, fine. So I volunteered. And it turns out that several years after the CDC concluded that they had no idea what was causing people to get sick in these buildings, we did discover Stachybotrys, which turns out to be the same one in your articles. So when your articles came out, I grabbed them, took them to the chronic fatigue syndrome researchers and said, this is it. This is the same mold that was overlooked at ground zero for chronic fatigue syndrome. And by then they had decided that they only wanted chronic fatigue syndrome to be a virus, so they refused to factor this in. And that situation continues to this day.
Yeah. Yeah. If it had been a virus, it would have been much more difficult to point the finger at anybody and say you're responsible too.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the medical mind behaves this way. You would think that they'd be interested in solving the puzzles, getting additional clues, evidence. But just like with Barry Marshall, that's not how they are.
No. I don't know exactly why. I will tell you something. A very dear friend of mine, one of the top diagnosticians in Los Angeles, when I wrote the book, I gave him a copy of it. He got back to me and he said, you know what? Because he's talking about people with, in this case, it might have been called multiple chemical sensitivity, chronic fatigue, etc. But this epidemic. And he said, oh, half those people are nuts. That was his answer to me. And my answer to him was, what about the other half?
Yeah, at least some of us can't be nuts. We can't all be nuts.
What about the other half? So even if you're going to say that, what about the other half?
But as you pointed out, the vested interests have already established and entrenched themselves in whatever they want to pursue, and they cannot be dislodged at this point.
That's true. That's very true. And when the Cleveland infants, they had some serious vested interests. Of course, the insurance industry, and the mold bloom nationally was taking off like crazy, with Melinda Ballard's $32 million verdict and everything else that goes with it.
I had been absolutely certain that when I sent this article about Melinda Ballard to the chronic fatigue syndrome researchers and informed them that we actually found this toxic mold in the sick buildings where clusters occurred, I would get an instant response. Mm. I didn't expect that they would behave in a really anti-research manner.
Yeah. You know, please.
Go ahead.
No, I
was just going to say that we really need a sociological investigation into why these researchers behave the way they do, because we thought if we present them with good, solid evidence, they will be compelled to respond. That's what integrity is all about. That's part of their job description.
And the question becomes, where does their funding come from? Because on the university level in particular, the funding comes from industry, hugely so, and industry related foundations, etc. And that's the problem, I think. You know, with Southwest Airlines, I was wondering what kind of response they were going to have to this Time magazine article that lit up the damn globe. And I don't mean to put a feather in my cap, but it really felt like it. They crawled under a rock for a week until it went away. That's all they did. Not a word, not a call to me, nothing. Not a call to Time, not to the newspapers, magazines. When the San Antonio Current did a 4-page story on the women and with an interview with me and everything, not a word. But
that's
they
exactly
did.
What I found with researchers. If they can ignore it for 2 or 3 days, they consider it's been dispensed with.
And that's it. Yes, but that doesn't happen here, and it's not going to happen here. Because
so
it ain't going away.
When in the San Antonio reservation terminal, was chronic fatigue syndrome brought up at any point?
Oh, constantly. Chronic fatigue, a full body weakness, they called it. It wasn't just the fatigue. Yes, chronic fatigue, but it was an entire body weakness where they could barely stand up from their seats at times. So yes, it was very much a part of the spectrum, if you will.
And there was no discussion of actually looking into what this chronic fatigue syndrome was all about?
Not back then, no. None whatsoever. You had Andrew Campbell, who was talking to the gals and examining them as a doctor on the outside. And that was about it. And what could he tell us? No research at the time. Pardon?
My motivation in agreeing to serve as a prototype for this new syndrome was that chronic fatigue syndrome researchers will have to be interested in the evidence, so therefore they will respond to whatever we find in the sick buildings. And then when mold researchers begin to emerge, they're going to wonder if their paradigm is connected to this famous syndrome. So with 2 different professions all converging to look at the same thing, it would be impossible not to connect toxic mold with the syndrome.
Yes, yeah. And this is a kaleidoscope of symptoms caused by something that we just don't understand in terms of how it works. But we do know that it has an extreme neurologic effect on its victims. And this includes big time the chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah, at lower levels, it seems that the immune dysfunction leaves people open to so many other infections. Right. That it's impossible to really say, okay, you've got this specific symptom because instead you've got cancer, or you've got aspergillosis, or you've got a fungal infection or a bacterial infection.
Well, it can cause, I think, the immune system become distracted to the point where it can't do its job. And that bacterial or viral infections might have an upper hand in such an environment. Is that possible?
Absolutely. That's exactly the pattern.
Yeah,
So,
and that Eric's, I don't know if you can see what's behind him, but it says chronic trichothecene mycotoxicosis, maybe indistinguishable from CFS. I mean, T2 trichothecene mycotoxins, I just wrote about this the other day, that they completely impair the immune system and allows it to, you know, invite these bacterial infections and inhibits it to be able to fight these off. So,
well, they don't necessarily invite it, but what they might do is distract it to the point where it's unable to do its job. Yeah. If you take a nasal, steroid to treat nasal problems, over a period of time, if you use that, it suppresses the immune system in that area, and you wind up with a fungal infection. It's called oral thrush. Why did you get it? You always have fungus in your body and in your mouth. But when the immune system becomes suppressed in that area, or if it's distracted for that matter, that's when those fungal will take off and take over. And that's the way that works. That's known. That's right.
And we've also found that specific Stachybotrys toxins prevent cell division. They're powerful protein synthesis inhibitors. They actually stop cell mitosis. Mm-hmm. So the body cannot regenerate.
Let me tell you something. This is what you were talking about that really stimulated me. And that is that a researcher once said to me, and you wonder, why would nature put mycotoxins in Stachybotrys? There's got to be a reason for it. And a researcher once said to me, that is the means by which Stachybotrys is able to take over its environment. When a building becomes wet, the first thing to come in are Aspergillus and the other molds. And then after about a month, in comes Stachybotrys, and it stakes out its territory, as he said, by using mycotoxins to put the other ones out of commission. So what does it do in the human body? Do those mycotoxins do the same thing by putting systems out of commission? And that's made sense to me, a lot of sense.
Well, after I saw your articles and learned about Stachybotrys, I made contact with researchers, got a full education on it. And since we made the correlation in the original clusters of chronic fatigue syndrome, the ones that were investigated by the Center for Disease Control and were the basis for this new syndrome, there were some other clusters in sick buildings down in Sacramento. So these were considered to also be examples of chronic fatigue syndrome, even though they weren't subjects of the original study, but they were accepted as being congruent with chronic fatigue syndrome. So it was a simple matter to just pick up the phone, call the survivors, the teachers from these buildings in Sacramento, and said, well, did you find Stachybotrys? Yes, they did. They knew all about it. Yeah. So we've got repetitive examples of Stachybotrys showing up in clusters of chronic fatigue syndrome. We've got abstracts written by researchers claiming that they're looking for clues. And so now it's just a matter of getting them to accept this evidence and put the pieces of the puzzle together.
And get the funding to do so. And not go against those who have funded them in the past in the process. That's what's going to be tough, I think. And the insurance companies are all worried that if Stachybotrys does get branded for what it has been doing, let's say to the human neurologic system, it's going to make a lot of people who have been sick up until now suddenly feel that they can sue, whether it's the landlord or the insurance company who didn't take care of it or whatever.
Well, it really looks suggestive that in the late 1990s, after such an enthusiastic reception to Stachybotrys, where the Center for Disease Control, their scientific investigation appeared to be perfectly normal, and they threw everything into reverse. And all of a sudden, researchers were finding it extremely difficult to get any funding. There was every request they put in for a study to get support for a study on toxic mold suddenly ran into all kinds of roadblocks or was denied completely.
If you want to understand the whole thing, for me to see this, and what I found and what shocked me so much was that after the CDC did their study about Stachybotrys and pulmonary hemorrhaging, hemosiderosis, after they did that study and found there to be a connection between the two, the Stachybotrys and the bleeding out of the lungs of these children, when they found that out, the new group called in to review the information that those researchers used to make their assumptions or whatever it was. The new group called in, number one, they had all testified in mold cases prior to this on the sides of defendants for insurance companies and landlords. Those were the ones reviewing the CDC findings. And number two, the director of the CDC, the new director of the CDC who called in that study was the immediate past president of Prudential Insurance. And prior to him, that CDC director had also been the previous president of Prudential Insurance. Both of them had been presidentially appointed. And it's not a left-right thing. It wasn't a Republican. In fact, in this case, it was Bill Clinton who appointed this former president or immediate past president of Prudential Insurance to be the CDC director. What a conflict of interest. It goes to the top and it goes on both sides. It doesn't even have a party. It's just there.
And then add to this, the CDC epidemiologist, Ruth Etzel, who so brilliantly narrowed it down to Stachybotrys, was suddenly a pariah. Her research came to a dead stop. She was basically run out of the CDC.
She went to the World Health Organization. And then she caught the same, she wound up having the same thing happen to her when she went over to the EPA. And it was with regards to the lead poisoning in the children that she made a big deal of. And all of a sudden she was fired from the EPA too. Etzel has had quite an experience.
Dor Dearborn also attempted to gather additional research about pulmonary hemorrhage from Stachybotrys, did find many examples of this,
yes.
Tried to use this to get more investigation and substantiate his earlier hypothesis, and there again, hit a dead stop.
Yeah, with more and more babies coming in with pulmonary hemorrhaging, which is expected to be seen so rarely, hardly ever. And he had 50 of them by the time my article came out. He had 50 babies with pulmonary hemorrhaging coming in by the time that article came out. And there were more nationally. They did a brief survey, and it continues to be so. And by the way, in the military housing now, where they're having a problem at one of the bases, Fort Bragg, they have just such a cluster of infants dying. And they say there's nothing to say why they're dying. 3 infants died in the same house from 3 different families. And there's nothing to say whether they're dying. The only thing they found that was reported, and it wasn't reported by the researchers, was that there was toxic mold. They found mold, but they didn't know that's nothing.
Well, I've toured many sick buildings, and you can just look around and say, wow, there's a lot of people here with nosebleeds.
Yeah, that's right. Melinda Ballard, all of them have nosebleeds. You're right. That's a typical manifestation.
Yeah, these people they're waking up every morning with blood on their pillow.
Yes. All through the military too, in those moldy homes. Yes. And in the children, where you have the hemosiderosis, the bleeding out of the lungs, is because their alveoli are not completely formed and very fragile. And those mycotoxins get in there, and they do to the alveoli in those infants' lungs what it does to probably the nasal passages in people who are coughing up blood.
Yeah, researchers, doctors like to imply that if you get out of the mold, your problems are over. And yet we find that Stachybotrys in particular has demonstrable pulmonary arterial remodeling. So there is permanent damage from this.
And now they're starting to find associations between this and the autism spectrum. That's starting to come out. I know one of your recent guests on this podcast was talking about that.
Yeah, Dr. Andrew Campbell came on and
yes.
telling us the link, and you know, he's in Mexico doing this research. So it makes me wonder, you know, I'm not speaking on behalf of Dr. Campbell, but in my own mind, I wonder, is he going there because he can't get the funding here? You know?
Very possibly, yes. I can tell you that other research has been done. And in fact, there's a published study, in fact, making this, I won't call it an assumption, but let's just say they really think there is a link. And I did some writing on autism, and the autism is believed to be starting in the first trimester of pregnancy, when the brain is forming in a toxic environment, and you have proliferation of nerve fibers to receptor sites. And in fact, it was found recently that people who have autism have a proliferation. They have 4 times the number of nerve fibers going to receptor sites inside and outside their body, which accounts for a lot of distraction in people who are on this spectrum. And this is the recent science on that.
So those of us who have,
mycotoxins too.
So those of us who have tried to get federal institutes and even our own trusted Emmy CFS researchers to look into this have been stonewalled. We've been put off. We've been unable to get their interest, even though this is really well documented. To me, this is tantamount to research fraud. Yes. With evidence this strong, it seems like a researcher would be obligated to at least take a look at this evidence.
I think there's a word here that we need to use, and I'll say what it is. Scandalous. It is absolutely scandalous, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of the scandal.
Well, my basis for volunteering to provide a tangible link between the toxic mold phenomenon and the chronic fatigue syndrome is that with evidence like that, they wouldn't dare to deny it. Because if they were exposed, they would lose their credibility. And yet I find that this doesn't seem to bother them at all.
Risk-benefit ratio. I'm sorry. This doesn't.
They tell me, well, chronic fatigue syndrome has moved on since then. We've changed the definition. We've created a new definition. So your old evidence no longer applies.
The question becomes, what is the risk-benefit ratio to changing what we've been saying and coming out with the truth? And the risk-benefit ratio for them is still off the charts in the way of risk. I think that's probably what's going on here. It's sad, more than sad.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for your book. Your book has pointed us in the right direction. This book's name is They're Poisoning Us. So check it out on Amazon. We'll have a link below. But, you know, it's pointed us into all these directions with all these experts. And you, as an investigative journalist, in your opinion, how should we deal with this? Or in your role, how can you deal with this kind of scandal and all this stuff going on? I mean, can you recommend anything that people in our audience listening, is there anything that we can do with our own time and our power to make this known, to reveal this, so that way people like us who had suffered from mold illness can actually get help?
Just keep going for the truth. Stick with that. It might be a big distraction to talk about how these guys are stopping us from this and that's stopping us from that. That could be a distraction. And you'll wind up with more coming in to defend them because there's more money out there to be made. But if you just keep going after the truth, sooner or later, that truth is going to win out. That's what I think. That's, as an investigative journalist, that's what I live by. It's just finding out what the heck is going on here and exposing it. And then again, and again, and again, until nobody dares stand up again, until they all hide under their damn rocks and the scientists do their jobs.
I actually asked Dr. Barry Marshall that very question. What does it take to get through? And he told me evidence will eventually prevail.
That's what I'm saying too. I agree with him completely. He's a genius. He should have gotten a Nobel Prize for just that statement.
Well, it was clear that he literally had to give himself the infection and cure it under supervision in order to get his story looked at.
Exactly.
So we are in a similar, very, very similar situation where simply proffering evidence, just providing evidence to researchers isn't sufficient. We need to up our game a little bit, take it to the next level, really embarrass them for not acting like real researchers.
Yeah. I suspect you're right. If there were only a bug at the bottom of this, but there are so many bugs at the bottom of this one. So many different kinds of exposures, stachy mycotoxins, trichothecene mycotoxins. That's one of them, one of the big ones. And there's other exposures as well. And getting to the bottom of this is much more difficult than finding a bug and holding it up.
Yeah, I think the change is really going to come from the mothers of the world who are sick and tired of watching their children come home from a sick school, just totally beat to death and bleeding.
You are so right. And I'll tell you what, you've completely nailed it. Because in the military, with all the sick buildings, the husbands can't come forward because their jobs are on the line. And the story that I'm writing about this, or that I was writing about this, that I'm still going to do, is called Military Wives Go to War. Because that's the way this thing has finally come to Congress. They can't ignore them. And maybe the mothers of all these children should get together and say, Cleveland is real. It's here too.
Absolutely.
If you can make that happen and have them acknowledge that, I mean, bless you and bless your heart, because we have been fighting on our education front. One of the people that investigated and said this is Stachybotrys is not connected. And we have been fighting this guy for a while. So if you can get them to acknowledge that, that would be absolutely incredible.
Yeah, you know, there was, in the Cleveland story, there was a family that came to me, but what happened finally was that they accepted a bunch of money from the insurance company and it was over and they just went away. So it's not easy. But like one of the military wives said to me, she said, there's a lot of mad mamas out here. And that's one way to go after this thing. Good. I agree with you.
The other thing about the Cleveland incident is, if I understand this correctly, the Center for Disease Control initially pressured Dearborn to call it pulmonary hemosiderosis, which is a fairly narrowly defined illness. It's generally genetic, and it is measured by a buildup of hemosiderin, iron, in the macrophages.
Interesting.
And this wasn't actually present in the Cleveland infants. There was a slightly different mechanism. So they actually said, your hypothesis of hemosiderosis is incorrect, as a means to act as if it wasn't happening. So that's kind of a dead giveaway, is if somebody insists on calling it hemosiderosis rather than pulmonary hemorrhage, it's a distraction, a means to cast it out.
Yeah. I'll tell you what's interesting in my mind. Somebody once said to me, genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And that made a lot of sense to me. Yes, certain infants are going to be maybe more at risk because of their genetics, might make them more at risk for the hemosiderosis or bleeding in the lungs, whatever. But that doesn't take away the villain in this case, which is in fact the mycotoxins.
I mentioned my background, how I was familiarized with toxic mold prior to the chronic fatigue syndrome incident. where I was in the military, and my nuclear missile unit was sickened by toxic mold down in the basement. And it was so devastating that my unit was actually removed from the active service roster for rate of illness. And while some people think that the military was completely familiar with toxic mold back in the 1970s, my commander called the Biological Warfare Division to come out and investigate. They attached no importance to it. They said, well, it looks bad, but clean it up. And my commander told me that if the rate of illness did not subside after cleaning up the mold, that he was going to order an emergency evacuation. He was going to literally take the entire unit and move us out to the field. But within a couple months after getting all the mold out of the basement, the rate of illness did go down and people started to recover again. So that was my primer for what happened later when a flu-like illness hit my region at North Lake Tahoe, and all the people in the sick buildings had the worst outcome of it. It was identical.
Yeah. The one thing that I found, and you folks are all very much aware of this, is how Stachybotrys mycotoxins were used by the Russian military, and it's in our own military handbooks, as a chemical weapon called called yellow rain, and how it's in our weapons. It's in our military handbook, and we have it documented with the military saying how these mycotoxins can cause all manner of disease in society and on the battlefield. And now they're telling everybody in the military housing, oh, Stachybotrys doesn't cause anything but little allergic reactions. And there it is in the military handbooks.
Yeah, their product is doubt. If they feel that they can cast any kind of uncertainty on a situation, then they can delay for a while and then just move on to other things and forget about it.
And their motivation is the fact that they have privatized all the military housing. They've farmed it out to private companies, and they've been covering up the bad work that these private housing companies have been doing in terms of the plumbing and everything, and the ignoring of the mold that is making all these people sick. And the military is as much involved in this cover-up as those private housing companies are too, because they're all liable.
Did you ever hear about the 1992 Sacramento Twin Towers complex sick building syndrome incident?
I think so. Refresh me.
It was the major center for the California State Department of Public Health and many of their government offices. And thousands of people in this building suddenly became, well, not suddenly, they had been having problems ever since the building was open, but it gradually got worse until it was so bad that they called for an investigation. And the Center for Disease Control actually came out, and this was in 1992. They did a survey and found that about 20% of the occupants of this building had symptoms consistent with chronic fatigue syndrome. So their conclusion at the end of the study was that these buildings do have a risk factor for chronic fatigue syndrome. And 2 years later, the very same investigators, Keiji Fukuda and Dr. William Reeves, wrote a new chronic fatigue syndrome definition, which said that there were no known risk factors for chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, their own study did not agree with their new chronic fatigue syndrome definition. So this is really like the smoking gun for CDC corruption.
Yes. Yes. At every level. And it leaves you speechless sometimes as to what could possibly motivate a human being or a collection of them to behave in such a reprehensible manner.
how can they get away with such corruption in plain sight?
It's not plain enough. It's not plain enough. We're going to make it more plain.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're so grateful to have Arnold on the podcast today. We've been actually waiting for this moment for quite a while. We're just so excited to have him because he is one of the good guys. His investigative journalism is superb. All his other books that he has done and written about in the medical field are amazing. And the #1 book that could definitely benefit all of us is reading They're Poisoning Us, just to understand what's going on. You know, why when you go to the doctor, does that doctor not recognize that you're even ill? Well, there's a lot of political makeup behind that and a lot of insurance stuff behind that. So if you want to go ahead and check that out and check out the reasons why your doctor doesn't know how to treat you, read his book. We'll go ahead and post that below. Also make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our content, and make sure to donate to our GoFundMe and Patreon pages so we can keep this podcast going. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.